Okay, it's 5 minutes after 7. Giving people a chance to join in here. My name's Daniel Weber. I'm from Penn State Extension. I'd like to introduce the main event host here, Miranda Sazo from Cornell University. He's going to kick things off, tell you a little bit about what this event is and how it's going to work. Mario, off to you.
Hey, thank you. So we would like to welcome you to the third season of the Virtual Orchard Meetup this summer. Since 2021, the Virtual Orchard Meetup program has brought together growers, researchers, and government and extension agents to have an international conversation. International because we are connecting Canada and the US about important tree fruit topics connecting the industry leaders across North America. In our first meetup in 2021, something that we started between Bernardita Sayato from Washington State University, Nawali from Michigan State University when she was there, and myself, the conversation focused on all aspects surrounding honeycrisp production at that time, rootstock choice, nutrition, and storage. So last year, we joined effort with Dan Weaver from Penn State Extension and Christy Greg McGuffin from Ontario Minister of Agriculture from Canada, and address labor issues and technology advancements to improve orchard operational efficiency. Over 20 experts have been involved in these meetups, interacting with more than 1,000 participants in the last 2 years. This year, we are very happy to announce that Emily Lively from Michigan State University Extension and 2 new members from the British Columbia government in Canada, Lindsay Henstock and Kathleen Hengel, have joined us for this season and in the future. This summer, we will focus on the topic of managing the uncontrollable. Over the past decade, growers have been forced to confront wildly changing winter temperatures and even excessively heavy precipitation events and extreme temperatures coupled with extended droughts. Here in the Northeast, from where I'm talking today in the Finger Lakes, close to Lake Ontario Fruit region, this spring we had excellent pollination weather and what appeared to be an excellent crop. Unfortunately, this unexpected frost of Thursday, May 18, results in some damage across our state. We recently just finished a long dry period of 5 or 6 weeks in some areas, and in the last 3 days, we got 2-3 inches of rains. We just finished the first round of the return bloom spray for honeycrisp and Fuji in inland and lake sites. And in the last 7 to 10 days, we began the hand thinning job. And very recently, we started also the deshooting of on-farm nursery trees in our region. Today, we have a beautiful sunny day without rains. So these meetups this summer will be conducted live on Thursday at 4 p.m. in the Pacific Northwest and 7 p.m. in the eastern part of North America on June 15, today 19, and July 13. Each webinar will last more or less 90 minutes. The format will include brief presentation by specialists engaged in discovering and engineering solutions to these problems, followed by a grower panel of industry leaders who are confronting these issues head-on. The meetup will conclude with an open discussion in a very inclusive virtual format. Viewers are invited to share solutions, ask questions, many questions, and interact with the specialists and panelists. The program is free of charge. So the schedule of topic is as follows. Today, we're talking about cold stress. On Thursday, June 29, we're going to be talking about water stress. And on Thursday, July 13, we're going to be covering heat stress. So whether you are a fruit grower with ample experience, one that has a moderate experience, or one that is just getting started, the virtual orchard meetup will be the right setting for you to ask questions and find alternative solutions. So please get comfortable, enjoy the meetups, and type your question in the chat box. There will be plenty of time for questions and answers. Thank you for your participation. The virtual orchard meetup team, Bernardita Sayato, Christy, Daniel Weaver, Lindsay Henstock, Kathleen Hengel, and myself. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to start off by briefly introducing the panelists that are joining us tonight. You'll get to meet them a little bit later. We'll introduce them first, so then we can jump right into our two special guests tonight from Washington State University and from Cornell. Our panelists tonight are Steve Brown from Happy Valley Orchards out in British Columbia. We welcome you. Same with Tom Ferri from T&K Ferri Orchards in Ontario, Randy Hart at the Hart Apple Farms in New York, Kyle Rasch of Tom Rasch and Son Orchards in Michigan. We were supposed to have somebody from Pennsylvania tonight, Steve Freecon. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. He had a conflict that came up, and so he will not be joining us, but hopefully I will try to represent his points of view when we get into the panel discussion later. We do have two special guests tonight. One is Garrett Henry from Douglas Fruit and Douglas Ag Services out in Washington. He's joining us from the panel to represent Washington State, and Dr. Terence Robinson. If you've been in the orchard business for any time at all, even just 15 seconds, I'm sure that Dr. Robinson's name has probably entered the conversation one way or another, whether you knew it or not. We're glad that he's here, and we will be asking him a few questions, and he will be sharing some of his insights. So we welcome him and thank you. I'm going to turn it now over to Emily Lavely, who's going to introduce our two main speakers.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that we have two great speakers tonight who are actively doing research in relating to cold. And so Dr. Matt Whiting is going to be our first speaker. He's a professor at Washington State University, and he specializes in a range of topics such as whole tree physiology, high efficiency orchard structures, orchard technology, and control of fruit quality and pollination biology. And he is specializing also in bud physiology and cold hardiness and plant protectant products. So I'm looking forward to what he's going to share tonight. And we also have Dr. Jason Londo, and I'll introduce him before his talk. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Super. Thanks, Emily. And thanks to the broader and ever-expanding team as well. It's awesome that you guys have put together such a great group and provide such a wonderful service for the industry in North America. Just to confirm, are you able to see the title slide there, everybody? Yes?
We are.
Okay, super. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I'm really delighted to join you guys for this cold topic in the 2023 kickoff session for your virtual orchard meetup series. I'm Matthew Whiting. I'm applied whole tree physiologist at Washington State University. Got a long list of co-authors here. I just really want to point out the first two, Dr. Brent Arnold-Dusen, a PhD student from my program who graduated over a year ago, but a lot of his data will be shared. And John Magby, who's a current PhD student who's about to graduate shortly. I'll be sharing some of his data as well as we go through sort of introductory comments that I'm anticipating will set the stage a little bit for the conversation with the rest of the group. And lovely photo you'll notice in the background here. This was taken about a year and a half ago as our sweet cherries were pretty much at full bloom last year, and yet had a wonderful insulating coating of snow on those. Cold damage, you guys are connecting because it is a perennial problem. And it is predicted to become an increasingly significant problem. There was a recent report from the FAO that documented and demonstrated that cold damage of all environmental phenomenon is the most negative impact of all weather hazards for temperate tree fruit crops. And you probably understand this very well from your own operations. And to put it in very simple terms, cold damage occurs when the temperatures, the weather, in your block drop below the threshold, or what we just generally call the hardiness of a crop, or the ability of the tissues to withstand those cold temperatures. And we'll get into this in a little bit throughout the presentation here. So this damage then that occurs when temperatures exceed the ability of the plant to handle those temperatures can vary, right? I mean, sometimes there's a reduction in yield. This is very difficult to quantify often, but you'll hear people talk about a 10% loss or a 30% loss. And this, of course, translates to and can equal thousands of dollars per acre in loss. In very unusual situations, of course, cold damage can provide a useful thinning effect, but that's obviously impossible to manage. And And yet we see a lot of these headlines from complete crop failures, or when the remaining crop is uneconomical to harvest. And these are just a few that I've listed here. 2007, those of you out east, actually it was more of a whole East Coast phenomenon with an estimated $2 billion of damage to tree fruit and other fruit crops on the East Coast. 10 years later, the southeastern US fruit crops, including peaches and blueberries, were estimated again greater than $1.2 billion damage. Very recently, French vineyards were nearly wiped out, and that $2.4 billion of losses were predicted by the AP. And that photo in the background was taken from that freeze event in the beautiful wine-producing regions of France. So, as I went to further substantiate the topic and the interest in cold damage, I thought I'd begin with a quote. Many thousands of dollars can be saved annually by properly protecting orchards from frost industry. Wow, right? That's not all that novel of a concept, and I just showed you some data. But what is interesting, this quote's from 1907, over 115 years ago. That it actually was in the USDA annual report. There used to be one report from all of USDA. So even back then, this was identified as an extraordinary concern. But I'll tell you what, you look now and you're going to find headlines that are a lot more recent. Frost wipes out kiwi fruit, jeopardizing harvest. This is October, of course, is when they're flowering in the southern hemisphere from New Zealand. Agricultural emergency decreed from damage by late frosts in vineyards and fruit trees. This was last year in Argentina. The Malbec crop was nearly completely eliminated, so fairly recent. Northeast growers seek federal assistance for vineyard and orchards hit by late frost. Mario mentioned that May 18th event that occurred in the Northeast. That was from the Associated Press yesterday. So after you've had some time to assess the damage, now you're seeking federal assistance for these issues. And guess what? Chilean avocado and citrus industry impacted by severe frost. Literally, that was 3 hours ago. So I often do this. You just get onto Google News and you type in cold damage and fruit crops, and you'll be inundated with examples. So we don't need to beat that point to death, right? It's quite clear. So there are three distinct periods when growers tend to be concerned about frost damage, and they all obviously are interweaved among these. But it's the late fall or the early winter, and we're concerned about damage at this time when plants have not yet acclimated to the inevitable cold events. In the midwinter, we're concerned again when low temperatures will exceed the tolerance. And then again, we become especially concerned in late winter and early spring as trees are transitioning from endo to eco-dormancy and are losing their ability to withstand cold temperatures. It's quite an extraordinary photo that I took about 15 years ago, but this was in a grower's reaction in response to that late fall, early winter freeze. Of course, you can see the bins were laid out. The fruit is all over these trees, and yet in the desperate times call for desperate measures, and running the under-tree micro sprinklers for hours on end was led to that extraordinary photo. And of course, the crop was damaged. You can see here internal apple core temperatures of 14 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is maybe a new ice cider market for that at that point. Clearly, crop destroyed from these events. And in fact, this is 2002. This was the year that I was hired by Washington State University. You're looking at air temperatures and October 31st, Halloween freeze. This is one of the first things I did in my job. So we've been looking at this for 20 some years, was the damage in the late fall or the early winter, a cold snap that was on the 31st, and it wasn't preceded by really any significant cooling. And so there was great concern at that moment. And my predecessor, Ed Probsting, and I cut through hundreds of spurs as he was showing me how to assess damage in those buds. And actually at that stage, we're also very worried about damage to the xylem tissue and spurs, as you can see here. In the middle of winter, actually, and perhaps paradoxically, it's the period where tends to be the least damage, even though the temperatures are the coldest. And generally speaking, we're worried at this point in the loss of hardiness and increased sensitivity to warm weather spells that can occur periodically throughout the winter. And then, of course, we've got the spring. This is a classic chart that demonstrates phenotype or growth stages of cherries, and then the affiliated sensitivity of those buds at various temperatures. This is the period where generally we have the greatest damage. It's not exclusively related to, but it is important, the increased water content in buds at this time and the increased sensitivity to cold damage. And we'll hear a lot about your experiences with this. And some of those first bullet points that I had in the early slide from damage tended to occur from early bud break and then following cold temperatures. So as we think about it from a grower's point of view, or from a researcher's point of view as well, I believe there are three key questions that one asks when you're worried about cold damage. The first of which is simply, how cold will it get in my area, in my orchard, in my vineyard? And the next question then, of course, then is, how tolerant is my crop at that moment as we're being exposed to those temperatures? And then the third part, which I think is quite interesting, and there hasn't been as much research in this area, is what are you going to do about it? So you know how cold and perhaps you know how tolerant it is, but what are the tools that you've got available? And I'll finish up with a little bit of work we've done in that area. So I take about these first two portions of that, which are the critical decisions, is temperature forecast. There's a lot of weather stations and networks that do provide regional forecasts, and perhaps there's some internal farm networks that you're using to better understand and better predict temperatures on your farm. And then there's the second part of the hardiness of the cultivars that you're growing in your situation, at your stage of growth, and etc. And I would suggest that there is a lot less known about the hardiness than there is about the temperature forecast. I'll get into that in a moment. My colleague here, Dr. Love Coate, has been working on a cyber physical systems funded project to look at the Internet of Things enabling frost monitoring. So he does a lot of work with sensors and sensor technologies. I'm going to share with you a couple of slides from his work just to demonstrate the thought process that's involved here, which is more of a hyper-localized weather data, which is his way of saying not a regional forecast, but an intra-farm forecast and better understanding the dynamics within each farm, following temperatures, bud temperatures, air temperatures, looking at critical thresholds at those different growth stages, and then having a system that would be coordinated to activate preventative measures if necessary. So generating all of those data based on what the temperature profiles are, and what the sensitivity of your crop is, and whether or not there is a critical threat to initiate perhaps a wind machine or under tree sprinkler. So there is an effort in that to have this micro level control. And he, with some of his graduate students, have been done some interesting work now looking at the temperature inversions that relate completely to the efficacy of a wind machine, right? It only works in a radiative frost, and only when you've got a significant inversion. And so they've been using drones with these towers and temperature sensors to map the temperature response from wind machines or under tree micro sprinklers versus no treatment at all. So there will be some more interesting data coming out of Dr. Coates' program in the next few years. Okay, so that's related to the one question of how cold it will get. We hope to understand this a little bit better. In terms of how hardy the crop is, we've been doing a lot of work on that in my program with students over the years. And basically, in the midwinter temperatures, we're able to, under full endodormancy, do differential thermal analyses. This is possible because, generally speaking, prunus species, sweet cherries, super cool. And when florets, individual floral initials, freeze, they release a heat signal from the heat of fusion of water, and we can pick that up by differential thermal analyses using plates that read that heat signal and convert it into an electrical signal. And you can just see examples here. Each of these colored lines is an example of a single cherry bud, a dormant bud that's placed on these plates and run through the programmable freezer. So each of these peaks is basically a cherry bud that's a floret that has died. So it's a very powerful analysis that we can use to monitor hardiness and document sensitivity to temperatures. And I'm going to summarize here 8 different genotypes from from John Magby's work. Now, this is plotting from that acquisition of hardiness in the fall off on the left-hand side through to the loss of hardiness as you get into February, March in the Northern Hemisphere in spring. And there's a couple of key points. Hardiness is very dynamic. Hardiness is gained and lost in response to environmental phenomena. And that's quite clear that you can see here. Hardiness is also affected by cultivar. We're finding that those old bud scale charts with hardiness and bud timing are essentially useless or a reasonable guide. But as new genotypes are developed, and you can see here just one small example of about an 8 degrees Celsius range in hardiness in the point of endodormancy for 8 different sweet cherry cultivars. And I would suggest to you also that there's a long list of other factors that we're just beginning to better understand, including tree age, orchard architecture, the nutritional status, crop load in the previous season, as that relates to stress and what those trees have been exposed to. Rootstock may come up, and others unyet determined and undocumented. But we're interested in these factors to try to better understand. Now, here's a chart that looks at the same time period from acquisition of hardiness onto the loss of hardiness throughout the middle of winter. Also data from John Magby. 20 different genotypes here of cherries looking at this seasonal trend. And a couple of things that I just want to point out. We have in the fall this transition from paradormancy to endodormancy. Two key issues here that you can see. Again, look at the range among those genotypes. It tends to be nearly 10 degrees Celsius. So there are very sensitive cultivars and there are hardier cultivars at each of these stages. The other one indicated by these arrows is that rate of acquisition. In other words, how quickly does a cultivar react or respond to those environmental cues and gain tolerance to cold? You can see I've just highlighted a few with the slope here would relate specifically to that. So it's different again among genotypes. Now you get into the midwinter season, which we refer to as endodormancy and accumulation of chill. Again, an extraordinary range among genotypes here. Some are very sensitive in midwinter and some are very hardy. You'll also see that these lines tend to be a little bit wavy for some genotypes, but they don't all follow the same pattern. So we're seeing a range in sensitivity to that gain and loss of hardiness throughout the winter, which is also extraordinary. And now we get into the spring. This is that transition from endo into ecodormancy or loss of hardiness. And again, the key point, a large range among genotypes in their hardiness in the spring. And these arrows also just illustrate another key point is the rate and the timing of the loss of hardiness. So you can see that trees, different genotypes lose hardiness. They make that transition from endo into ecodormancy at different moments, almost varying by a month. And then when they, quote unquote, sort of decide to go through a bud break and loss of hardiness, they do so at different rates. And really quite an extraordinary range. Okay, that's in the interest of time, that's really all I wanted to share with you with what we've been looking at recently. And then, of course, the question is, what do you do about it? And there's a list of some of the potential techniques and tools. Under tree irrigation with micro sprinklers. It's very popular simply because there is the BTUs or the heat associated with non-freezing water. Over tree irrigation is used, but infrequently any longer. Heaters, of course, various styles and types of heaters, wind machines, helicopters. There's a lot of conversation now about going back to work that was done even a century ago, looking at plant growth regulators and nutrient sprays to influence this. What about anything else? And I just want to finish up with what we're doing in our lab to answer that third question was, well, what can you do about it? And this is some work that we've done with a multidisciplinary team of engineers as well as physiologists, where we're looking at what we call plant-based dispersions. This is work that we identified the utility of cellulose nanocrystals or nanofibrillated cellulose, which is a byproduct in essence from processed wood pulp or pulp fiber. And what we've learned is that when you spray this material, it creates a very effective insulating layer, which I always provide the analogy of putting on a winter coat. That's one of the modes of action. And the benefits, of course, that we see compared to traditional tools like lighting candles you can see in the background, it's renewable, it's environmentally sustainable. We found that, that simple application techniques using your farmer's existing equipment are effective, and that even a single treatment can provide excellent resistance. And I'm happy to announce actually that the patent that we've had with this has been licensed by a commercial company. We've been working with them to try to get this product available into the future. So here's a photo of an electrostatic sprayer putting on an application into a commercial apple orchard in the Columbia Basin from a few years ago. So again, using standard application tools. So what we would typically do is spray out this material, and then we would cut bud wood and then bring it into my lab in the programmable freeze chambers and run it through and assess whether or not the treated buds were any hardier than untreated buds. And we do this again with differential thermal analyses. You can see that each of these curves is a plot of all of the depth of flowers. In this case, it happens to be sweet cherry, Rainier. You brought in wood 72 hours after an application. And you can see that whether 1% of this plant-based dispersion or 3%, there is a shift of those curves to the right. The right means that the wood is hardier, more resilient to cold temperatures. When you analyze all of these data, you can generate a lethal temperature required to kill 10% of the buds, or 50 or 90. And you can see a table of that, where the 3% suspension was able to improve the LT10, a radical shift here of more than 8 degrees. So extraordinary response from these plant-based dispersions. Just another example of some work that we've done in apple. This was a week after applications were made, again, using commercial equipment at the stage that you see in the top right. And here, I'm showing you by incremental degrees of Celsius, the percent mortality of apple buds. And the gray bars are untreated, and the red bars are where we sprayed with our plant-based dispersion. And it's quite clear that there's a real shift to the right. In other words, improving the hardness, improving the resilience of those buds to cold temperatures. And in this case, estimated to about a 7.5 degree Fahrenheit improvement in LT10. And I'll finish with one final example of a few years ago, where we did an air blast application with a commercial farmer of sweet cherries, very close actually to where Garrett's farm is, to an early robin cultivar. 2 applications of 2% sprayed by air blast. And the nice thing about this was not taking fruit into our lab in a programmable freeze chamber. This was in response to a natural frost freeze events in the field. We went out and we measured yield at harvest, and there was about 17.5 more pounds of fruit in where we had treated those trees and protected them with the plant-based dispersions. And at that tree density, that translates to about 9,000 additional pounds of fruit per acre in response to that. So we're seeing good improvement in hardiness with these treatments. So let me finish up with where to from here. Well, some work that's being done through our Ag Aid Institute is including modeling of hardiness by genotypes. Down the track, we anticipate this as being a tool provided through Ag WeatherNet or other forecasting tools. Micro forecasting, the work being done by Dr. Coates' lab is of interest as well. One of my students now is looking at the genetic elements, along with many other labs around the world. As we screen these genotypes and identify great phenotypic variability, then the next question, of course, is, well, what are the genetic elements related to that? And in the long term, then number 4, of course, would be breeding for improved hardiness. I was really interested to see in the poll results that 70% or so of you said you do consider a genotype's hardiness in making those selections. And I just wonder about, wow, where are you actually getting data on the hardiness of different genotypes when you make those decisions? Interesting. 5, we're actually looking at developing a hardiness service center at WSU so that growers can bring in samples so they can analyze hardiness and report to them what they are. And looking again, finally, at new tools for reducing cold damage. Daniel, anyway, with that, I conclude my initial introductory statements, and happy to leave my email if there's follow-up questions, and happy to join the rest of the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing more about your work. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but if you do have questions, we're going to have Q&A for both speakers after Jason speaks. So feel free to put those questions in the chat and the speakers can respond to those. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Jason Londo to give his presentation. He's a professor at Cornell University, and his research focuses on climate adaptation in fruit crops, specifically apples and grapes. And some of his work is focused on stress physiology and genetics of different cultivars and how they respond to climate. And he hopes to use that information to create models to help growers select appropriate cultivars for their areas. So Jason, go ahead and start your presentation.
Okay, you can see my slide okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for having me. This is really interesting. And thanks, Matt, for the first talk. Some of the information will be a little bit overlap between our introductions because we work on very similar things. I'm going to talk to you today about apple rootstock and Scion cold hardiness in a couple of projects that I'm working on here at Cornell. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. Okay, so just to address the question, why do we study cold hardiness? You know, we're all here for the same reason. Cold issues cause problem in all of our fruit crops. Typically, apple trees are pretty cold hardy. The damaging events are characterized by acute cold in the late fall before dormancy is induced, just like Matt said, during midwinter when we have false spring events, or in late spring frosts. The reason I got interested in looking into apple cold hardiness, I worked on it in grapes for a very long time, but I was introduced to it in apple as it may relate to this rapid apple decline syndrome where apple trees are suddenly collapsing during the growing season, usually when they're carrying a high transpirational load. And some of the patterns of damage that's associated with these collapsing trees, and some of that I'm showing you here on the right, indicate damage at the graft union and the rootstock shank. And there seems to be some patterns with certain rootstocks being more sensitive to this syndrome than others. And so I got very interested in why that particular part of the tree might be affected by cold damage. And if we think about the grafted apple tree and we think about changing climate and erratic snow cover, the rootstocks and the scions may be experiencing very different winter conditions, which can lead to desynchrony between these different portions and increase the risk of cold damage. In addition, because we're working with species material that come from very different gene pools, as you just saw with the cherry response, there's a lot of variation between cultivars in their cold hardiness response. Well, when you add the rootstock level to it, you add an entire new gene pool. And so that really can amplify some of the differences that we just saw. And so just as a primer, again, this is repeating, but cold hardiness is the ability to resist freezing temperatures during winter. And this dashed line here on the right represents the cold hardiness curve. If the variety we're studying is able to dodge all of the coldest temperatures of winter, it successfully has cold hardiness, it successfully transits the winter. The early portion of that curve where you gain cold hardiness is called acclimation. We just discussed that the middle part is called maximum hardiness. And then the exiting of cold hardiness in the spring is deacclimation, and typically deacclimation occurs at a rate that's faster than acclimation. This is this transition from acclimation through maximum hardiness to deacclimation is interlaced with dormancy, and that there's this transition from the early portion of dormancy, endodormancy, where heat is the plant is able to resist heat. That transitions to ecodormancy, where the plant is no longer able to resist heat and responds very quickly. And that transition is governed by chilling hours, which maybe you're all very familiar with chilling hours, but it's basically the plant's ability to track the length of winter by the hours spent within certain temperature ranges. So what I'm showing you here in this blue arrow and with this clock animation is that for every hour the tree spends between 32 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it counts as 1 towards some magic chilling number that enables that transition from endo to ecodormancy. And so this dormancy transition is overlaid on the sensitivity of acclimation and deacclimation parts. The reason this is sort of interesting from a grafted apple tree point of view is if we think about the exposure of the different parts of the grafted apple to winter, and we think about snow cover, you can have some very interesting microclimate dynamics. So temperatures above snow cover will typically be much colder than beneath snow. I think we all know this, that snow is a very good insulator. And so the Scion portions of the apple tree are navigating winter with our air temperatures, right? But if you are the rootstock shank beneath the snow, you're experiencing a very, very mild climate, sometimes up to 20 degrees difference underneath that snow when temperatures are below freezing. And so what that causes is it causes two different winter experiences. So the Scion goes through the winter getting the maximal cold treatment. The rootstock shank goes through winter getting a much muted cold experience. And since a very mild winter will produce less cold hardiness, you have this potential issue where the rootstock thinks that it's an entirely different climate. If that snow then melts in midwinter when we have a false spring, and then the temperatures plummet, like back into February temperatures, you can imagine that rootstock no longer has the capacity to survive that rapid cold drop. And so it's this interface that I found really interesting about working in the system. And so what I've been doing is I've been studying the cold hardiness in the rootstocks and science in order to try to disentangle how these different components all work together. In apple, we use a different method than what Matt presented on the cherry buds and what we use on grapes. We use a couple different methods. We can't use the supercooling system to detect the peaks. The freezing mechanism in apples is different. We can use oxidative browning, and what we do here is we basically cut tissue from the field. We freeze it at several different temperature steps in a programmable freezer, then take it out of the freezer and let it sort of come back to temperature and oxidize. And what we could see is a phenotypic scale of damage based on how brown the stem pieces get. And that brown oxidated color is from the cellular leakage from freeze damage. As it leaks out, oxygen interacts with it, turns brown, and we can use that scale to sort of say, okay, where's the cold hardiness cutoff in a similar way that they can use supercooling. And so here you could see with the rootstock G935 at control, very green tissue. This is degrees in Celsius. So as you go down in 5-degree increments, you start seeing this brown damage here at -25. There's even a little bit here at -20. By -30 and -35, you could see that even the xylem portion of the stem is now totally oxidized. So this is clearly dead. Somewhere in here between -15 and -25, there's a difference between repairable damage and mortal damage. So this phenotypic scale is workable. It takes a lot of plant material. And one of the issues that we have identified with using browning is that not all cultivars brown in the same way. And so here's a couple examples. G222, G935, and B9 are all rootstocks. Gala is at the bottom, there's a Scion. And what you can see is that 222 doesn't really brown much at all, no matter what temperature it's at. It's clearly taking damage because all this tissue is waterlogged, but it doesn't brown in the same way. And so it's tricky to compare the browning level of 222 with the browning level of 935. If you start looking at the red-leafed varieties, they also have purple stems, which makes brown really tricky to discern. And you also have issues here, like in Gala, where you see some browning at low temperatures, then the appearance of perfectly fine tissue, a return to browning, and then a return to fine tissue. And some of this is because the tissues themselves are going to have slightly different cold hardness throughout the winter. So we can use oxidative damage to look at it, but I prefer to use, I don't really like using phenotypic observation because you need to have the same observers doing the damage calls all the time. And so I like to use numbers, and I use electrolyte leakage. This is another method that is very, very similar to the browning. You collect the tissue in the same way, you freeze it in the same way. The only difference is that we measure that cellular leakage based on how much the conductivity of the water that the stem piece is in changes. So as you have increased levels of damage, more and more of the cellular components leak out into that water, and we can measure that difference. And we do this with a robot auto sampler because we do hundreds and hundreds of tubes at a time. And so here, the little video on the bottom is just showing you, this is sped up, how we increase the phenotyping capacity within our lab by using automation. And so this robot takes these electroconductivity measures, and what we do is we take the measurement after the initial freeze event, the one that we're trying to figure out how much damage occurred. We take that measurement, we divide it by a measurement after we put them in the deep freezer to really kill them, and then the relationship between those two measurements gives us a relative damage. So this is just like the oxidative damage, but instead of looking for brown, we're looking for the change in leakage. That data looks similar to this. These dots that are on here are for these 4 different months. This is the amount of damage we register at each different temperature as we freeze these stem segments from 0 down to -60. We plot a curve through these dots in order to determine what the critical thresholds are. And much like what Matt talked about with the supercooling, we compute a lethal temperature 50, which is a convenient number to do statistics on. It represents the midpoint between the start of damage and the end of damage. But we also like to compute these other points. Here's like the lethal temperature 25. And if you overlap the oxidative damage imagery with the electrolyte leakage, you can see, oops, that if we are using LT50 damage, we're really talking about trees that are already dead, not halfway dead. We want to look at something a little bit earlier. So all of the data I'm going to show you going forward is this LT25, which seems to correlate pretty well with damage between the cambium, where you're just starting to get a little bit of brown, and damage where the cambium is fully browned. So a little preface on what it looks like to look at cold hardiness. So Matt showed us how different cultivars have different curves. I'm going to show you the same thing. Sorry for the repetition. I want to show you these 2 particular winters, though, that I've been working on apple. So here is the temperature curves for the 21-22 winter, so 2 winters ago, and then the 22-23 winter, so our past winter. And you'll notice that as you look at hourly temperature here, that the early portion of winter is pretty similar between the 2 winters, and the late portion is very similar. But here in the middle, we had a really weird winter this year where we had this normal cold decline. We had this precipitous drop at Christmas. I think everybody remembers that cold event. But then in this year, we got really warm, and we stayed really warm until this very steep drop in February. Contrast that with the year before, you can see that steady drop in temperatures through midwinter. So this is the orange year has a very nice V shape to it. The blue year comes down and it basically stays flat. That's really important for looking at the next couple slides to understand why cold hardiness curves change as much as they do. Here's an example of 2 of the rootstocks in my system, M9 and G41. And pictured in each of these graphs, again, it's the same 2 years in the same color scheme. So orange is 2 years ago, blue is this past winter. You can see here the curves for the LT25. So in 21-22, here's M9's cold hardiness, nice U shape. In 22-23, here's M9's cold hardiness, and it's no longer even a U shape. It's really ugly. If you look at G41, we have a little bit more of a repeat of the curve, but the key thing here is you see how this point pops way up, and it pops up here too. What we're seeing here is midwinter deacclimation. This is what we talked about, where midwinter is usually the safest part of winter, but if you have a warm spell, you lose cold hardiness, and that can be very problematic. And as you can see for M9, the loss of cold hardiness was enough to, by the time we had this February event, that we likely sustained some cambial damage in M9, whereas G41 is safe. You can also see that in both years, M9 is less cold hardy. So this orange year, the U shape is higher than in G41. This is similar to what Matt was showing with his cherries. So in 21-22, it was 13 degrees Fahrenheit less hardy. And in this past year, it was 24 degrees less cold hardy. This next slide is going to be a little overwhelming. Do not look at all the graphs. I want to step you through it. It's just the rest of the rootstocks in my study. And what I want to show you is that good acclimation signal here can be seen in many of these different rootstocks. So many of our rootstocks acclimate very well, but we had a serious situation with deacclimation this year. You can see in many of these rootstocks, this deacclimation bump. And what that did is it raised our cold hardiness curve for the whole winter, such that we had a lot of rootstocks that suffered potential damage. There's a few, like G41, which did a really good job in both years. There's also a few here like 969, 935, even G14, where they didn't gain a whole lot of cold hardiness, but they're not very reactive. See how reactive G222 is? So what we need when we think about rootstocks in a changing climate is something that acclimates really well, has good deep winter hardiness, but doesn't deacclimate fast. And what we're seeing here is that for a lot of these, good acclimation is coming paired with bad deacclimation. And so we're going to have to do a lot more years of study to try to figure out which of these rootstocks are most resistant to that midwinter warm that we just experienced. In case you're not a chart person, this is a table of the same data. And what I just wanted to show you here, these are the LT25s in degrees Fahrenheit for each month, November, December, January, February, March in 21-22. And then in this past year, we went all the way through April. The colors indicate the depth of cold hardiness. And so you can see just by looking at how red this year is that all the rootstocks performed less cold hardy than in the previous year. The rootstocks that performed really well in both year are these CG, these early series that are in Gennaro Fazio's program, 5087, 5257, G210. G213 did kind of well, although it suffered some damage here at the midwinter. G41 did the best in both years, and G890 seems to have done well. If we look which rootstocks are predicted to have the most damage in 22-23 in response to this cold snap, it's basically anything that was less cold hardy than -7.2 Fahrenheit, because that's the minimum temperature we got to. So you can see here, there's a couple selections, B9 and G11, G814, G969, M9, and Ottawa 9 all were predicted to have sustained some cambial damage this past winter. I also screen Scions. The story here is both less interesting and more interesting. So one thing you can notice here, all of these Scions, the cold hardiness curve is in black. In the dashed red line is the M9 cold hardiness from the previous slide, and in the blue dashed line is G41. And that's just to give you an idea where the Scions land relative to the least cold hardy and most cold hardy rootstocks in this year. And what you can see is the black line in most of these Scions is almost flat. There's almost no curvature to it at all. But that flatness maps very closely to M9. So what we're seeing here is the Scions are definitely on the weaker side of cold hardiness relative to the rootstocks, but the flatness tells us that they're much less able to acclimate, but also much more resistant to deacclimation. And I've only done the Scions in 1 year, so I don't have a real cold year to show you. I'm hoping for a real cold year this next year, so we can look deeper to see variation in the Scions themselves. But the take-home message here is that the Scions are less cold hardy, but also much less reactive. If you look at how cold hardiness is dynamic across the winter, here I've ranked in each month the different genotypes. So in gray are all the rootstocks, in green are the Scions, and in yellow are Scions that are cider varieties. And you can see at the beginning of winter, the rootstocks are all the weakest, and the Scions are more tolerant. But as you move through the winter, they start switching positions. That rootstock ability takes over, and you see more and more cold hardy rootstocks. By the time here's the cold event. So everything above this line is expected to have taken some damage. And by the time we get to the end of winter, you can see the rootstocks have moved back to the most sensitive. So that's reinforcing what I mentioned about quick deacclimation ability, but also very quick deacclimation ability. And that deacclimation ability means those roots are waking up earlier than the Scions, potentially. So just to wrap up, these studies are ongoing, and this is the second year of the rootstocks and the first year of the Scions. It's important for us to get this data to establish baselines so that we can understand how climate will affect it. We're looking at freeze recovery research to understand how much of this damage is actual repairable and how much of it is we can kind of ignore. We're doing deacclimation research to see if we can correlate the temperature sensitivity of the rootstocks with changes in bud break and flowering time. And we're looking at rootstock Scion interactions to see if the rootstock's differential ability to send hormones and nutrients through the xylem has any effect on the Scions. And with that, I just want to thank my crew, my technician Hannah and Maria, and then the technicians and students in Terence's program that are really helping with collecting the material and chopping things too. Erica, and Luis are postdocs, Julie's a student, and Spencer's a technician. And then just to thank Gennaro and Terence for giving me access to all of the plant material. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. That was really interesting. Learned a lot from both of your talks tonight. So we do have a question here from Matt Whiting for Jason. It says how to validate rootstock differences in lab tests with natural events in the field.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to do whole tree freezings and do the damage recovery to see how well it correlates. But yeah, because we'd have to cut into the plants themselves in the field to look for damage, yeah, that could be really tricky.
Yeah.
If you've got good ideas, let me know.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a tough thing. Just, just looking at the differences between the 2 years and the level of cold tolerance just based on weather and figuring out how to do your testing. So Matt, I don't know if you had a comment, if you wanted to.
It's really difficult, yeah. I think that's why most of the work has been done lab-based testing, particularly the genotypic screening. But then I think Jason made a good point about the recovery, because that's often a question, isn't it? What is actually lethal to a spur or to a root or to a portion of a root system as well? The younger roots versus the more supervised dignified roots. And the same questions go for above ground portions of trees too. This came up a lot when we had early fall damage, where we found actually that there was more browning in the vascular tissues, particularly the base of spurs in cherries, than there was actually to the flowers. And the huge question there was, well, is that lethal? Right? Is sort of a partial damage? Is that will that sort of have a girdling effect on the subsequent growth? We don't really understand those very well. It's very difficult, and I'm not sure the answer to that on how to actually assess that the healing in response. Generally speaking, though, I'd be interested to hear the growers' comments on this. The field damage tends to be a little bit less, and perhaps that's related to the plant's ability to heal, or partial damage that we assess as lethal in lab tests. So it's an interesting concept.
Yeah. Yeah, Matt, I was surprised too to hear you say that those critical temperature charts should basically be thrown out the window.
Well, that was a bit harsh maybe, but the point being, I think Jason's data really substantiate what we're seeing in cherries. It's not the case, I should preface that the chart that I showed was actually from 30 years ago, but it's largely unchanged, right? You'll see cherries and it'll show you the stages and the LT 10, 50, and 90. And yeah, absolutely. It's just genotype is one of the factors. I think we're starting to understand more of the other environmental factors as well, but that contribute to a lot of variability.
Yeah, I know we experienced some challenges this year just looking at the charts, and there were definitely discrepancies in how much damage we saw. Can both of you comment on, because I know you're both doing very active research. Jason, if you need to step away for a minute, that's fine. But you're both doing research in this area, and we can talk about it. If you want to save it for the panel discussion, we can do that too. But just be curious to hear your thoughts on what would you tell growers now as they're making decisions. We've used these charts for a long time. For example, we've got a lot of new rootstocks coming out. Are there things that you would tell growers to either be cautious about, or how to think about selecting varieties and rootstocks in the next 5 years, maybe?
Well, one of the things that suggests is collect your own data. Collect your local data, right? If you've got a cold event, you've got an opportunity to collect data for your cultivars and your rootstocks in your farm. And one of the simplest ways is, of course, just to cut wood after a cold event and bring it into the office and leave it out at room temperature for 24 hours, and then start to slice through the tissue and look for some of that, look for that browning that Jason was showing. There are other guidelines online that can't get into exactly how the best way to interpret those, but generally speaking, I bet there's an extension agent local who can help you out with the interpretation of those data. And then you're starting to generate your own information for your farm and thresholds and when you should be worried. And then you can kind of use that as a multiplier or a factor to incorporate into the traditional bud charts. But we don't have those for rootstocks though, right, Jason? I mean, there isn't.
No, I would say, we're working fast to try to get this on the radar, right? We know the Scion part. We know what survives winters and what doesn't from historical plantings. From the rootstock point of view, we know we're working as fast as we can to get this trait as one of the many traits in the decision-making process, right? Some of the rootstocks I say might be doing well, and cold hardiness might really stink for other reasons. And you have to balance what you're trying to do with any one piece of genetics. And so the microclimate differences, the regional differences, those are super important. We have to do this sort of work in all of our different growing regions, because cold, dry winters versus cold, humid winters, they're different. Snow cover, no snow cover. Matt had this on his slide too, the number of things that can affect the freeze tolerance of any given tissue. It's really complex, and I'm not trying to overwhelm anybody. It just means that we have to keep working on it. And as the climate constantly keeps moving, we also have to work together and share what's working, what's not working. There's no way for any one region to sort of solve this on its own. So.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, Emily, this is the reason that for next winter, what I'm trying to establish is a service center here where growers can bring in their samples, and we'll run them through the chamber and tell you, because there are efforts to model this, and there's been work. My colleague, for example, in wine grapes, Dr. Keller, Marcus Keller, has been working for. He inherited a model, and then he took it on and tried to refine. Has been refining it for 20 years, and actually, they're still not super comfortable with it, and particularly as it responds to the different genotypes. So modeling, I think, is a very long-term prospect. It would just be a general guideline, again, maybe to complement those charts that we have. But I think in the interim, I think, just having the ability, or a service center where you could run your samples through. It doesn't take very long to freeze down wood in anticipation of a cold event and get some information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It actually ties in well with the question that came in also, asking, are there any indicators that we can analyze for trees in the fall to predict their cold hardiness? So you just suggested freezing wood before a cold event.
Right, that would be in a controlled freeze event, and a controlled freeze process. It is important that, you couldn't just throw them into a -20 freezer and expect that would replicate what happens in the field. There is quite a bit to the process, or the freezing rate of freezing, for example, among other things. But indicators to analyze trees for hardiness. Wow, that would be nice. Nothing comes to mind at all there. There will be questions and concerns about the stress. There's a lot of talk actually about nutrition. We've looked at that and not seen a very strong role at all for nutrient status and hardiness. So unfortunately, in my experience, maybe someone else has got something. There are not very good indicators in the fall for looking at hardiness.
No, we're working on it, right? Because if we had a biomarker of some sort, so we didn't have to do these freeze tests, we would use them. The tests are laborious. The comment from Kyle, excessive end growth. Anything that doesn't allow the tree to shut down with the fall cues is going to hurt you, because that acclimation process can't happen during active growth. And so putting on fertilizers and pushing the trees to put on vegetative growth is not, well, I'm a biologist, right? I'm not a grower. From the biologist's point of view, that's not a good idea to push them further in their growth cycle. They need those cues. And in fact, some of the PGRs that we're testing to enhance cold hardiness shut the trees down faster, right? We want them to senesce and start using the temperature cues in the dormant state rather than in the growth state. They cannot read the cues the same way.
Yeah, we've done some work to do early defoliation or to initiate that process, or sort of artificially earlier, like many nurseries do actually, and that improves hardiness. So as Jason's saying, if you the worst case scenario is a delayed transition into endodormancy, and if you can hasten that and encourage that earlier, that can be effective.
That actually leads very nicely into the panel discussion, because a few of the panelists have mentioned that in their regions, they've noticed that the trees do not seem to be senescing on time, that they've seen leaves hanging on the trees as late as December. So perhaps we should transition then, Emily, if you think that's a good idea. We're a little bit after 8, so I think we should probably get moving. Is that all right with you? You got any other questions? You want to tie things off? Or?
No, that's great. Thank you both, Matt and Jason, for presenting tonight.
Yeah, I hope you'll stick on and contribute to the discussion here as well as we go through some things. So I'm Daniel Weber from Penn State Extension. I'm going to be talking with the panelists here. And so I'd like for the panelists to start off by introducing themselves. And so if you're on the panel, and that includes you, Garrett, since you're representing Washington State, whoever wants to go first, go ahead. I'm looking at Kyle, so I'm just going to say, Kyle, go ahead, you be first, and then everybody else just follow through.
Fair enough. That's what I get for asking a question, I guess, earlier.
Yes, it is.
Or answering. So yeah, my name is Kyle Rasch. I'm from Michigan, 3rd generation apple grower. We are roughly 1/3 organic, 2/3 conventional, and continuing that transition. We've dealt with plenty of frost over here, and this year was no exception. We had a late frost that we found some damage in, so we're mighty familiar with cold here. Would you like a more elaborate introduction, or is that good for now?
No, that's good.
Deal.
Tom, you're unmuted. You want to go next?
Okay, that's great. My name's Tom Ferri from Georgian Bay, Ontario, Canada. Sort of across to the east of Kyle, more or less. And my wife Karen and I and a great staff operate a super spindle orchard in that area. And as Kyle said, we've had our fair share of ups and downs with freezes and what have you, and including this year. We are also the most northerly growing region in Ontario. So did anything?
Okay.
Hi, my name's Randy Hart. I'm a 3rd generation grower up here in Peru, New York, in Champlain Valley, in the northeastern part of the state. So we experienced some cold damage as well. Our farm not as severe as some others that are our neighbors, but we went through the same thing everybody else has. And it was interesting to hear some of the comments made by Matthew and Jason about the cold hardiness and the rootstocks and the different varieties. I can see it clearly on our farm, differences in how it took the cold this spring.
It's good you brought that up. We'll come back to that. In fact, I'm going to ask you to say a few things about what you observed, and if you have any questions for the specialist to ask. But in the meantime, let's see. Garrett, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Garrett Henry. I work with Douglas Fruit, Douglas Ag Services. Actually, we're the orchard management side of the company. Area manager, we grow apples, peaches, nectarines, apricots, cherries. We have some pears. All of our stone fruit, all of our peaches, nectarines, and apricots are organic. About 70% of our cherries are organic, and probably about 30% of our apples are organic.
Okay. Is Steve Brown on the call? Wasn't sure if he was able to get on or not. Okay, and I'll see a response. And since we have a guest panelist, Dr. Robinson, did you want to introduce yourself and say a few words to those that might not have met you?
I'm happy to be here. I've had a lot of experience in the field, working from northern New York down through southern New York, and just experiences seeing different cold events in the mid-Atlantic. And with nursery trees over the years, evaluating cold damage from early freezes. So I want to just later share a little bit about the field diagnosis of midwinter and late fall damage.
Hey, great, thanks. So to the growers that are on the panel, let's start off with a general question here. And Bobby, you kind of referenced it. What types of things have you observed over the past growing season here? We had a very abnormal winter, I should say, here in Pennsylvania. If Steve Freecon were able to have made it, he would have told you that we went through some pretty hard cold snaps, a warming period that was weeks and weeks early, then followed by another cold snap, and it's just been all over the board. Now we're dealing with a drought. So, Bobby, you referenced this earlier. Could you come back to that and talk a little bit about what you're observing and any questions you might have for Matthew or Jason?
Well, I would say that I agree with you on the winter. We had I would say a late summer like fall that just led into a mild winter. We did get some snowfall. We had a little bit of snow cover, but not what we typically have. Our cold temperatures were not near as cold as what they usually are. And I was thankful for that, just because we didn't have the snow layer protection. But what I'm seeing as far as frost damage and differences between rootstocks is this year is the intake of chemical thinner was more noticeable. We didn't have so much the fruit damage or loss. So I would say that the leaves were damaged, the foliage was damaged, and in certain blocks, the intake of thinner was considerably more than in other blocks with similar fruit set. So the thinning was quite a bit more extreme in other blocks. So that's what I'm seeing. And as far as the cold hardiness goes, I see we have a lot of G41s, and they were really hard to thin this year. And which is a good thing to have. I mean, I hate to be in the other position. So that's what I'm seeing on our farm anyway.
Matthew or Jason, you have any responses to about the thinning issue? Is that something that's been observed before?
You mean specifically the comment about or potentially there's some damage that would influence subsequent thinning efficacy?
Yeah. Is that a good representation of what you were saying, Bobby? That's sort of what I picked up.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly what it is. There were two areas of Honeycrisp in particular that the fruit set was about the same, and the rates we went in with our first application of NAA was the timing and everything was the same, and the area that we thought had some cold damage to the foliage, we didn't feel warranted a second application, where our other blocks did warrant the second application. So that's just notes as far as just my observations on my own farm.
So it's interesting. You're saying specifically you feel like there was damage to do you say to the leaves, to the vegetative portion of the tree from a late?
That's what I believe. Yeah. Is that that's what I think happened. Not so much to the point that we lost fruitlets, but to the point that I think that the foliage was damaged enough that it just took in this thinner that much more.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of an unusual scenario that you're describing, but you know, I have no reason to think that your observations aren't accurate. What can happen sometimes is that, generally speaking, in the spring, the floral tissues are more sensitive than the vegetative tissues, and so they die off first. But you're saying that wasn't an issue. What can happen, though, is what I think we observed with some midwinter and late fall damage is that it actually does damage the vascular tissue, typically at the base of those buds or at the junction of a short apple spur to the lateral branch. And that vascular tissue is really sensitive. And so if you didn't have the fruit set and you felt you didn't need a second application, it may have been result from something like that, the damage to the vascular tissue, rather than something that's obvious, right, to dead styler tissue or dead flowers or discolored or browned leaves. It's sort of an invisible effect, but it aligns, I think, with what you're saying you see in the field.
Interesting comment came in here in the chat from Jill McKenzie. She says that we see more Honeycrisp on G thinning more easily than Honeycrisp on B9 or M9, always, regardless of the winter or spring conditions. So it seems more widespread problem. I was just going to ask Tom a question, but I see he just stepped up. Tom, one of the things you mentioned in our pre-event discussion was that you noticed that in your farm you had abnormally low snow cover this year. Is that correct? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, our winter, for instance, it was not a typical winter either. We definitely had cold, but not the cold that we normally would have. There might have been, I'm guesstimating this, maybe a dozen nights where we went to maybe minus 10 or 12 Celsius, where normally January would be, most nights that would happen. So that was about all. And normally we would have here a good 1.5 to 2 feet of snow. And this year, we're lucky if it was 8 to 10 inches consistently. There was the snow cover all winter long, though, here.
And that is something else that we noticed in Pennsylvania, as Steve would say if you were here. We really didn't have much snow cover at all this year. We typically can get up to 20 inches in a single snowfall. And this year we didn't see anything like that for the most part. So at least in certain portions of the state. What about the other panelists? What was your snow cover like? And did you notice any damage or any sort of problems resulting from the lack of cover? As it was mentioned in the presentations there, that snow cover really has a buffering effect on soil temperatures for the rootstocks. Anybody else see this?
We're in the Columbia Basin and we only get about 8 inches of rainfall a year. So we usually don't get much snow cover. But we usually try to get everything pretty wet before we put it to bed. The one thing we saw this year that was interesting is we had a wonderful, beautiful fall towards the end of October, right at the first part of November. I don't know, somewhere by the 7th and the 10th in that range. Everything froze pretty hard, and we didn't drop leaves until March, and we were struggling to get things pruned. We were running de-leafers through blocks, trying to blow leaves off. Guys were running their sprayers through blocks, trying to blow leaves off so they could get in and prune. It was quite a challenge. And then on the other side of that, this spring, we had a real late spring, which was interesting because last year we had kind of an early, I don't know if that's what you call a false spring, but we had this early warming period where the stone fruit, the peaches and nectarines and the cherries came into bloom. But just about as they came into bloom, we dropped in, and we didn't have freezing temperatures really. We had some snow on the bloom, but it was really interesting because they just kind of sat there. And although we bloomed about 7 days earlier last year than this year, we're picking about 7 days earlier this year than last year, because we were really late, but we've had such a nice warm streak that the fruit caught up. Actually surpassed it, went past it. So it's been And you can see it's, I mean, as you can understand, it's just really challenging to put predictability into these, you know, into marketing and when you're going to pick and so forth, because it's just, you know, you're expecting like Cheyennes to be on the tree for 60 days. Well, last year there's almost 70, and this year it's like, you know, 52. So just makes it challenging to plan.
Mhm.
It's been interesting.
Yeah, for us in Michigan, I only have so many years of experience. I have to pick the brains of those more experienced, but it's less snow cover here as well. We didn't see much winter damage from what we can see thus far. But usually we don't get a king crop here. We often lose our kings to frost, and this year we actually had a beautiful king crop. And then we had a frost come in around, between 8 and 20 millimeters, depending on the variety, and projected to be 38, and it dropped down to 28 and 26 in low areas. So it threw a lot of people off guard. So it was a different frost than we've experienced in a long time, and seeing a lot of interesting things on fruit where either completely dropped 12, 14 millimeter fruit or wrinkled them up, or we have some beautiful marbling across the surface. So we'll see what that turns into later. But I don't know how to protect from that, to be honest. We threw everything at it and still had quite a bit of it pop up. So.
That actually is a good segue into the topic of frost and frost control. Emily, do you mind if I ask the questions, or did you want to tag team on this? No, you don't mind.
Yeah, I don't mind. I can jump in anytime, but go ahead. You're doing great.
All right. So what did all of you see as far as frost problems this year? We had a very, very early and mild winter for the most part, and then everything was several weeks in advance. We got hit hard in certain areas of Pennsylvania with a freeze. In fact, there are orchards just 10 miles from me that don't have a single peach on them because of this. So what about the rest of you across the country and up into Canada? What have you seen? And Tom, I'm going to come back to you to talk a little bit about your frost control, because you had some very good insights into how you manage it. But everybody on the panel, what did you see this winter? And how did you try to mitigate the frost? Or mitigate the damage, I should say.
Well, we had a fairly normal, I would say normal mild frost season. But we mitigate the frost with wind machines and with under tree sprinklers, and then in some areas, mostly on the high dollar crops, we have some smudge pots we put out, mostly only on cherries and apricots.
Kyle, I think you mentioned you were using micro sprinklers. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, we've tried everything as well, smudge pots, but at the moment we're mostly covered with wind machines, and then we've got micro sprinklers on most of the other areas.
So up in the Champlain Valley here, our farm we haven't really used anything to mitigate the frost. We use a little foliar nutrients to hopefully beef up the foliage after an event. But our neighbors have a lot of wind machines. I guess the best way we've mitigated is we've torn out orchard in our lowest laying areas, and I don't think they're going to be replanted. That's how we're seeing things done here in our area.
Tom, you mentioned that you have wind machines, but you also hire a pilot. Could you talk a little bit about that and what it actually costs to maintain all this and run everything?
Yes, we had a freeze the same time Mario talked, the night of May 17th and the morning of May 18th. Our Matsu crop was basically was full bloom, so it was the most vulnerable, and the others were sort of just in behind that. So we have one wind machine down in our low ground. The farm is sort of a southwest slope, and it goes down to a flat ground. We have one wind machine there, and then normally up on the hill it's about 2 to 3 degrees warmer. And in the past we've never put another wind machine up there, because you're not, usually not, it's a safer area basically. But in the past, if it was calling for some serious freezes, like this past spring, we've hired helicopters, and it's expensive. It's very expensive. It's $1,750 an hour. But we have Honeycrisp up there on the hill, and we get $1.40 a pound, which is $1,000 a bin for our Honeycrisp in the Ontario Food Terminal, versus 50 cents for our crop insurance, what it's going to pay us. So that's why we justify that. Our neighbors think we're nuts, but this year we do have a full Honeycrisp crop. We've lost our Matsu. It didn't matter what he did up there. It was just too cold for them. You say the word frost and they're done. I have 5 different stations that I'm monitoring at the 2-foot level and about the 6-foot level and then the 9-foot level with thermometers. And basically once he gets flying, we just keep monitoring those areas and hoping that there's an inversion. This year there wasn't much of an inversion. It was a -2 inversion Celsius. So, but at the 4-foot level it was at the 2-foot level down low, it was -4 to 4.5. So he was able to keep the temperature about the same all the time, if not, and even bring it up slightly. Whereas the unprotected areas, well, to my neighbor just to the north, he had a -6.6 temperature. So we figured we came through as good as we could. It wasn't a typical radiation freeze by any means. It was just a darn freeze top to bottom. And it's basically these choppers do work. Like I said, I can justify it because of how we're getting paid for Honeycrisp. And what we found too with him flying, they're skilled pilots. They have their night vision and everything else, of course. And because the helicopter, he can cover 30 feet each pass. Our plantings are kind of 10-foot space, like 10 foot between rows. So what, every 3 rows he covers and then turns. And there's a lot of heat comes off that thing too because of the exhaust. Like it's probably 800 to 900 degrees coming off the exhaust. So he's pushing down quite a bit of warm air too. If you have a great inversion, like you have a typical -2, -3 freeze and it's +1 up there, it's amazing how you can really bring the temperature up if you have to. And it's what Kyle mentioned, like it was only calling for 0 Celsius that night here, and there we are at -4.5 Celsius, which is probably close to 25 Fahrenheit, I would think, in around there. Mm-hmm. Anything else you'd like? I don't know. It's not for everyone, that's for sure. But our apples, we know what we're going to get for them. It's a set price with our buyer, and so we can justify that. Because $1.40 is a lot better than 51 cents from our crop insurance. We carry crop insurance too. But,
I wanted to ask you, because we had talked before, the panelists had kind of talked, if you do have frost fans or using a helicopter, what temperatures do you typically use to have your machines turn on?
Well, that night, the wind machine started before it was even dark. So you can imagine how cold it was. It was set for 0.2 Celsius, so just above freezing. And it's in a block of ambrosia, and then it goes into Honeycrisp. And the ambrosia that were the farthest from that wind machine, the far side of that block, they have damage, where the Honeycrisp and the ambrosia in that good zone of the wind machine, they're fine. I'm thinking this is my own thinking, was we didn't start flying the helicopter. It's a 3-hour minimum with these people. So you got 3 hours in no matter what. So it was about 2 in the morning when he started flying up on the hill, because we'd hit at the top of the pole, we'd hit about -2. So I got him going then. And what I'm thinking, where we've got damage, we probably started too late. And especially maybe the proof is in the pudding in this ambrosia block that's the farthest from the wind machine. And he would make a couple passes down there too. Well, there's damage there. And in that zone where the wind machine was, there's very little damage at all. But I think the main thing is to start these things quite a bit earlier than you think you should. And that wonder chart that Matt was talking about, it's not so wonderful. It's and the weather too. Like if it says here, we've learned here, like with Environment Canada, we're about 3 miles from Georgian Bay, so we're inland quite a bit. The farms that were right near the bay, they didn't have quite as bad of a problem as we had, and I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Yeah, they've survived it better just because they're near the water, and we aren't. We heat up quick, warm up quicker than them, and come out quicker. And but the key is to start things in good time. Like I think, in my experience, and when we had another farm in the south, we grew a lot of strawberries, so we did a lot of irrigating over them with overhead irrigation, and that was, in my eyes, that's still the best setup if you have enough water. We were near a river there where we just have holding pond here, so we don't have near enough water to do that. But anything else? I don't know. That's what all I have. I think be on top of it, and what your weather is like. Like I said, like when they say 0 here, they're meaning near the lake. Where we know we're going to be in the minuses here for sure, where we are 2 or 3 miles out from the lake, which is common sense usually. Anyway.
Yeah, so there's some good conversation going on in the chat as well. I'm not going to read that because it is 8:30, and I do want to transition just briefly because you referenced getting damage on your trees, especially the ambrosia and so forth. And I'd like Dr. Robinson to talk a little bit about, if he can still hear me, about what do you look for in cold damage? What are the typical symptoms that you see? And if somebody's got no experience with this, what would you tell them in order to be able to accurately diagnose damage and estimate, essentially what the crop's looking like or survivability of their trees even?
Well, the winter damage issue is really a rootstock related problem. When I've dealt with this cold damage, mostly in northern New York, we've learned over the years certain Scion varieties can't be grown there. Golden Delicious, for example, Jonagold. Other varieties, the traditional McIntosh, Cortland, and Honeycrisp, are much more winter tolerant. So I don't generally see winter damage on the Scion. The problems come from this part of the rootstock that is above ground, from the graft union to the ground level. And we tell people they should plant with the graft union out of the ground 4 to 5 inches. That 4 to 5 inches is the vulnerable area. And we've known for many years, as it's known by experience in the field worldwide, the M9 is sensitive to midwinter warm-ups and then cold snaps. It cannot be grown well in certain parts of the world. In Poland, they planted a lot of M9s, but because of global warming, they haven't had the same kind of winters, and so they're getting by with it, but there's damage there routinely. In northern China, M9 cannot be grown. In the US, we've adopted M9 wholesale, but there's been this underlying vulnerability ever since we've started. We see it at rare occasions. It has been not every year. So the 2016 event that happened in Pennsylvania and southern New York that then blew up into rapid apple decline, I believe was triggered by a cold event in February called the February Valentine's Day Massacre. And what I've seen over the years is when temperatures drop 50 degrees Fahrenheit, when you're in midwinter, you can get damage. So if it warms up to 40, 50, 60 degrees on some days for a week, and then drops to below 0 when you have at least a 50-degree drop or 55-degree drop, you tend to get damage on this part of the rootstock. But unfortunately, not too many people know how to diagnose it, and especially plant pathologists don't know how to diagnose it. So plant pathologists came in and tried to create a rapid apple decline problem. But this event in 2016 was largely confined to M9, where we know there's a vulnerability, and Jason Londo's data is proving that M9 has this vulnerability. The way I diagnose it in the field is I dig up trees and I cut with a pocket knife longitudinally down the trunk, starting at least a foot above the graft union, and then through the graft union, cutting into the cambium with cutting off slices of the bark, then down to the rootstock shank that's above ground, and then down further to the rootstock that's below ground. With winter damage, what I find is the Scion often is still green, but at the graft union, sometimes a few inches above the graft union, but mostly graft union down to the soil line, there's dead cambium. Then below the soil line, the rootstock is still alive. There's 100 different variations of gradations of this problem. So in some cases, there's mild damage and the tree then is weak and doesn't die, and the tree can slowly repair the cambial damage and xylem damage. But in other cases, the whole cambium is killed and some of the xylem is killed. And those trees then leaf out in the spring. They last as long as their reserves in the top can help them, and they collapse around bloom. Some of them persist until midsummer when it's hot and collapse. Some hang on the whole year and then collapse the second year. But those are all symptoms of cold damage to the rootstock shank that's above the soil line. So the work that we've done here with Jason is critical to rootstock selection when growers make decisions about what to use, because the orchard's out there for 20 plus years. And the odds are you're going to get some event with a false spring where it warms up in January and then gets really cold. Now, maybe that doesn't happen all that frequently in Virginia because it's warmer, but you never really get below zero weather. But in Pennsylvania, it did happen in 2016. In February 14th, it went below zero after several days, a week of warm weather. That happened to us in northern New York in 2004, where I had a big rootstock trial. And the next spring, after it warmed up around New Year's and then dropped on the 5th of January, all the M9s were killed. Almost all the M26s were killed. All of the M7s were killed. Surprisingly, Ottawa 3 also did reasonably well, but the big surprise was B9. 50% of them were killed. The only ones that really survived were, surprisingly, Mark and the Geneva rootstocks. So the Geneva rootstocks do generally have this ability in midwinter. Now we're finding with the work that Jason's doing, some of them have the same M9 type of problem. But that's another factor you got to consider when you pick your rootstock to plant your new orchard with. For example, G41 survives almost all false spring events in the winter. But for Honeycrisp, it's not the best rootstock because it takes up too much potassium. And so you get more bitter pit. And so you have to balance that cold hardiness factor with other factors. For example, with Gala, with Fuji, it's just a fabulous rootstock because it will withstand any sort of winter events, both in the late fall, midwinter, and even in the spring. But this issue is not that frequent. We don't lose a high percentage of trees over 20 years. And when it happens, people sometimes don't know how to diagnose it. And I hope that my method of diagnosing will be used anytime you see trees collapsing. If the Scion is alive, but the rootstock between the graft union and the soil line is dead, and the rootstock below that is alive, that was a winter event.
Thank you. That's an excellent summary. Just for reference purposes, if people want to review this, which I should say the recording will be made available online. But do you have this documented someplace that people can easily find to review later? For instance, a New York Quarterly or something.
Yeah, I've given numerous presentations on this particular topic. The last one was the Root to Fruit webinar, national webinar. But Jason and Mario and I have it on our calendar to produce an extension bulletin on how to diagnose rootstock damage in the field that leads to rapid tree death in the spring.
Yeah, that's good news. Look forward to seeing that. Emily, did you have any last questions here? Because it is 8:40. We should start wrapping things up. Or Mario, did you want to jump in with any questions? Or any
No,
of
I
the
don't
other
know if we have
questions?
more. I wish we could have more time, but I don't know where it's 8:41. So I don't know. Like I would like to have more questions to Terence. Like he could say a few things about G11 for up north for, like the thing that we know, Terence, I don't know, you could say the things that Jason have been discovering with G11 that is a little more sensitive.
Yeah, so I think that G11 is going to be similar to M9. If you've been
Yes.
happy with M9 and don't get ever much damage, G11 will be just fine. G41 certainly is superior in terms of the cold issue with this midwinter warm-up, the fault spring problem. Now it's, who knows? Will the future have more fault springs? It seems like it's growing in its problem. So that I think that over the long term, if you're planting a new orchard, you should take that into consideration. On the other hand, G11 is fabulous for fruit size and gives bigger fruit size than almost any other rootstock. It's better than M9 in terms of production. So you have to weigh all of those things when you choose the rootstock.
So Terence, what Dan was asking, like the talk that you gave in Interpoma in November, when we gave an update about the cold hardiness.
Yes.
And we wrote an article for our newsletter. Could we share that information through this group, or is something?
Oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that, but certainly you can share.
Can we share that? Okay, so Dan, I'm gonna send you that, and we can share more information.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Could I comment about one of the topics that Jill McKenzie has put up that we saw in the spring frost issue? I've not commented at all about spring frost in this webinar yet, but we had a range of damage to fruits where the entire fruit was killed outright, but probably turning out to be a bigger problem is damage to the surface of the fruit. Cells on the upward facing side of the fruit or on the calyx end, which is sticking up at that time of the year, were damaged. That leads to frost russet ring. We have a tremendous amount of frost ring this year. We also had some cracking of fruit. The fruit don't fall off, they don't thin off, but the fruit are cracked. And as Jill says, there's no market for this marked up fruit. So there's really, Matt Whiting should comment, but the ability, if you could put a little blanket on that upward facing fruit on the type of frost damage we had this year, might have prevented a lot of this ugly fruit that we're seeing in New York this year. Yes, we lost the percentage of the crop, but I think the crop will only be down 15%, maybe 20%. But we probably have another 30% of fruit that's just ugly.
Is there any progress on when the materials that Matt was talking about are going to be available to the general public? Any comments on that, Matt?
Well, we would certainly hope that for next winter, something would be available. It's kind of go through the processes of registration, and then which can be challenging. Although we do expect that that it will be relatively easy in that everything is generally regarded as safe with this material. In fact, it's edible. If you wanted to, you could drink it. But we're expecting it would be available. Of course, one of the excellent modes of action that we've learned this spring, with widespread, larger scale commercial testing across Washington, is that you just simply have to have totes of this material on your farm, and you're not going to have a frost problem. We saw that this year. I don't know if Garrett was involved with any of the trials. I can't recall, but we sent out a lot of material to a lot of interested growers, and we really didn't have a good frost challenge. So that might be just one of the modes of action.
That's one of the things Steve Freecon said to me this morning was he was accepting the thanks of people in Pennsylvania because he blew 10K on irrigation equipment and it finally rained. So if we need rain, just ask Steve to buy some irrigation equipment.
That's the way it goes, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually,
Matt,
one of the issues now is we're looking at various formulations. There's a lot of ways you can produce a lot of feedstocks that can go into producing the final product, and so they're really looking at refining it and optimizing its flowability, its ability to be handled and sprayed through commercial equipment without any difficulty. So, coming along.
And Matt, is there a thought on pursuing an organic label for that product?
Yeah, for sure, Garrett. Yeah, that's in fact, I think that's what this group is pursuing. That's what we had suggested to them. Where our role, basically, at this point, is just to support this company in their commercialization. So, yeah, I don't think that would be difficult.
I just want to mention real quick too, there are lots of questions and answers going back and forth in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, go ahead. And if you have questions, please include those if you're able to stay on a little longer.
Yeah, for those of you that are here, I apologize. Normally I have this set up in advance, and I realized halfway through this that I had not done that. But we usually put a page someplace that is accessible to everybody that'll have a copy of this recording, a copy of the chat that'll have the question and answers and so forth. If you come to the next one, which is on June 29th, same time, same URL, I will advertise where you can find that. Or you can just reach out to any one of us. My email is pretty easy. I'll put it in the chat so you can see it. And I will email you the location of where you can get to some of these resources, and also some of the information that Terence shared. If Mario's can provide that for me, we'll put that there as well.
Yes.
Since it is getting late, I would like to ask the panelists if you have any concluding thoughts. And the thought I was kind of leaning towards when I put together the outline for tonight was, if somebody that is listening came to you and said, hey, I've got problems with frost, I've got problems controlling it, or I've got problems with my trees dying, what do you recommend? Is there something you as a panelist would say to your neighbor, to your friend, this is what I'm doing? Anything stand out above all the others? What Dr. Robinson shared is very useful information. I'm curious what tips or tricks you have to share with somebody to say, I had this issue and I found that this was the best thing. Kyle, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah.
And then I see Tom did too.
I guess what we do that stands out for tree health is that we use mulch under most of our organic blocks, and we've stopped using weed spray. So we're just trying to do anything to remove any stress from the orchard, especially right on that shank that we're talking about seeing damage. So if there's anything to alleviate that. And then as well, we do quite a bit with foliar nutrition throughout the year, and especially in the fall, to try and really pump up those buds for next year in a way that doesn't make anything excessive. So we do a lot with sap testing to try and keep that balanced season long in preparation for the next year.
Thank you, Kyle. I don't know if you're aware of that, but you just answered a question from Sam DiMaria, who asked about mulches. So maybe you should reach out to Kyle later and discuss that with him. Tom, you have any advice to share with anybody as we conclude things?
I think too, the healthier the trees are, I agree with Kyle, the better they can withstand these things. And winter damage, just you hope that there's a good snow load, and so that'll help stop winter kill. And spring frost, like someone that's if they've had a lot of continuous spring freezes in the location, well, maybe you question where you planted the orchard. And if not, like these wind machines, they aren't the be all end all, but it's better than nothing. Hopefully you carry a bit of crop insurance too, I guess.
And again, if people can answer the survey in the last minute, whether
we'll get that
information, that is super important for us, please. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Hart, would you like to say a few words here as I share our survey link? And could somebody enter it into the chat, please?
Yeah, I think along the same lines of what Tom and Kyle have said, that, we use foliar nutrients to try to boost up the foliage after an event if we feel that there's been damage sustained. And we do as well throughout the year just to keep the tree health up. depending on crop load. But I agree with Tom in the sense that if you've got a historic area that's always getting froze out, it's probably not the best place to be having apples. So that being said, I also believe that there is worth of these the wind machines. There's value. And it may come to the point that everybody's going to have. So I think it's site specific, and you got to look at the history, and so that's about it. That's all I can really add to it.
Okay, and Garrett, did you have anything to say? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close things down.
Oh, I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach, and I agree with these guys. Healthy trees are going to be stronger. Healthy buds are going to be stronger. And I guess I see a lot of guys a lot of farms that if your critical point is 28, they may be starting at 30. Well, we try to give ourselves a little bigger buffer zone than that. We try to start a little earlier. I think sometimes we pick up some. We don't kill the bud, but we damage it, we weaken it. And after multiple events, then that bud is more susceptible. So we try to keep that bud stronger through the whole spring. And if we do get a real hard event, then hopefully that bud is in better shape to make it through. So that's kind of our approach.
All right. Thank you all. Emily, would you like to close us out here by thanking our panelists and our speakers and our special guests, and also introducing the next topics?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to the speakers and panelists for taking the time to share your experiences and your work. The survey is in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, please go ahead and click on that and fill that out for us. That helps us guide the next two sessions and future meetups. So do you want to just encourage you to come back, join us again in 2 weeks for the next session that's going to be on water, which is, I think, on everyone's mind at this point. And then 2 weeks after that, July 13th, we'll be talking about heat. And so look forward to those speakers and these grower panelists coming back and sharing their experiences for those sessions too. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.